Hi, I'm Chris McMahon. I'm the QA lead for the Wikimedia Foundation. We have Elisabeth Hendrickson here tonight. I want to tell you a little bit about Elisabeth and a little bit about QA at the Foundation. And I've been a fan of Elisabeth for probably 15 years now, at least. But the first time we met in public was at the Austin Workshop for Test Automation in 2005. And Elisabeth was at the 2003 edition with a guy named Ward Cunningham. You may know that name. I was there in 2005, and Elisabeth and I had a discussion in the Austin airport about beginner's mind and software testing. It stuck with me for ever since that time. But 2 years later, in 2007, I had a job. I was building this really complex automated test client code for a really complex API, and I dropped Elisabeth a line and said, hey, I'm going to be in the Bay Area for work. You want to just do a little peer conference like the Austin thing for testers who do development and developers who do testing? She said, that's a great idea. Harry Robinson at Google might be interested in that. And he was, and they said, Google would support that. You guys can come down to Mountain View for your little peer conference. And one thing led to another, and 150 developers from around the world descended on Mountain View because I asked Elisabeth this. 2 years after that, 2009, I was writing a lot of articles, and I was getting really tired of the echo chamber in software testing, and I thought we needed some new voices. And I said, Elisabeth, I want to do this peer conference in my hometown in Durango, Colorado. She said, yeah, I'd be on board with that. And thanks to Elisabeth and a number of other people, that happened, and a lot came out of that conference. Among other things, I think the first ever issue of any major software magazine devoted to women in test had probably, I think, 90% contributors that were either at that conference or involved in the wiki and the mailing list, something I'm very proud of. So at the Foundation just recently, we've made a lot of investments in testing and exploratory testing. And we just hired our second exploratory tester. We hired Rumana Yasmin a year ago, and she's made such an important contribution that we hired Elena Tonkovich just last week. And my team has been asked to communicate more widely what we do and how we do it. And exploratory testing has become so important. The first person I thought to call was Elisabeth. I'm part of a team called Release Engineering, and we are a service organization. We are 8 people in a field of 150 tech people at the Foundation, roughly. And our job is to get code from the developer's head to the production machine as quickly, efficiently, and safely as possible. And that's where QA comes in. There's only 4 of us at the Foundation with QA in our title, so it's kind of a historical accident. If you want to think of our exploratory testers as associate product managers, you can do that. If you want to think of our test automators as software developers who work in test automation, you can do that. We like QA. QA is not evil. That is QA at the Foundation. And without further ado, Elisabeth Hendrickson.
Thank you, Chris. I actually had totally forgotten how the Dev Test Dev conference happened. So thank you very much for reminding me. It was a good conference. So I'm the Director of Quality Engineering for Cloud Foundry. Cloud Foundry is an open source PaaS, a platform as a service. I like to say that we shave the yaks so you don't have to. However, that only works if you know the yak shaving story. You all know the phrase yak shaving? Okay, good. I won't tell the story then, unless we have time at the end. But the idea is that as an application developer, you want to worry about your application code. You don't want to have to worry about standing up a Tomcat server or all of the other associated infrastructure-like things that you might have to do to get that thing into production. And especially at the speed that most organizations are running at today, doing the file a ticket to get the ops team to stand up a new thing, and 6 months later you might get your virtual machine on which you can deploy your code. That doesn't work either. So a PaaS is a mechanism by which you can deploy your code. So Cloud Foundry, an open source one. I also work on the commercial side of Cloud Foundry, so we'll talk a little bit more about the size and scope of Cloud Foundry because it's relevant to this talk. As the Director of Quality Engineering, you might think that I direct a bunch of quality engineers, and that's actually not true either. We have 0 people in the rest of the organization with the word quality anywhere in their title. I'm the only one, and that's just because they had to give me a title, and we couldn't actually figure out that Elisabeth at large did not work in the HR system. And so the closest thing was Director of Quality Engineering. We have explorers, and we'll talk more, that's what this whole talk is about, is how we test Cloud Foundry. So we'll talk more about that. Cloud Foundry is massive. It is definitely the biggest project of my entire career. I wrote my first line of code in 1980. I'm totally comfortable with the fact that my code is quite possibly older than you are. That's fine. I'm cool with that. But it is massive, and I've been in this industry a while and seen massive things. I have not seen something quite at this scale before. We have 22 sub-teams across 6 sites. There are 100+ engineers, and the plus is because it kind of depends on how you count which teams as being in or out of Cloud Foundry at Pivotal, but it's massive number of engineers, 14 dedicated product managers, 4 designers, 5 engineering directors, and I did actually leave it off the list how many explorers, because we kind of count them just as engineers. We actually are down to 1 dedicated explorer. By the way, we're hiring 2. But our 1 dedicated explorer, it looks a little bit different than the rest of the engineers because he rotates through teams more quickly. He will come in and help a team learn how to explore, and within a few weeks then be off to his next team to help them learn how to explore. But we'll, again, talk more about that in a bit. Lots and lots of moving parts. So some of the big moving parts, Bosch, Elastic Runtime, service brokers, multiple command line interfaces actually, 2, 1 for Bosch, 1 for the Cloud Foundry. And each one of those things then has multiple components. So lots and lots of components and things moving. And then there's even more that's not on that diagram. There's these things called build packs, if anybody's used Heroku, like that, only we have our own forks that we maintain. More services. We've got our commercial side. Our ops manager is a GUI-based installer that wraps Bosch. So massive amounts of stuff. Anybody think I have a small amount of stuff to look after? Okay, good. Tons and tons of code. I used to show the code line counts, and then I realized I counted it wrong, so it was wildly misleading. But over 100 public repos, dozens more private repos that you can't see across like 4 different GitHub organizations, with components written in Ruby, Go, and Java, as well as tons of JavaScript and Bash scripts as well. So lots of stuff. And it runs on 3 different infrastructures. This is an open source thing. You can have your own paths behind your firewall, on your OpenStack cluster, on your vSphere cluster, or you could host it on AWS. And open source, commercial, plus we host our own. Have I convinced you it's massive yet? No? Okay, well that's fine. But people want to know, how do you test all that? Especially if you don't have anybody with the title quality engineer running around. How on earth do you test all that? Well, let me first tell you all the things that we don't do. We do not write test plans. You will not find giant binders of test plans with test steps and test procedures. We do not run manual regression tests. There is no big team that I'm not telling you about off somewhere else running these things. We do not have an independent QA team. We don't count bugs. We don't have quality metrics targets. So then that leads to, what do we do? I'm assuming that you're here because you actually care about that part, right? Excellent! So the first thing is the product manager's own acceptance. We figure that the best person to tell whether or not they got what they asked for is the person who asked for it. So a lot of organizations that I have talked to in the past, my job used to be get on airplanes, go help people. And usually what I was helping them with was an agile transformation. And they usually called me because they figured out in their agile transformation, they'd gotten to the point where they'd reached the QA department and they found a bunch of people sitting around going, what is this agile thing you speak of? And why are you trying to disturb this? And then they don't know what to do with them, and so then they would call me. And usually they called me saying QA is broken, and usually I would go in and discover that QA was the only functional organization in the entire company. But that's a whole other story from a different life that I don't live anymore. In any case, so in those kinds of organizations, sometimes they would take the QA people and have the QA people do acceptance on behalf of the product manager, only those 2 people weren't necessarily talking, or that set of people were not talking well, communicating well, and so the product manager would ask for something and then the QA people would be rejecting it based on criteria that the product manager didn't actually want. And so that's a massive amount of churn to put into a system. You are now injecting requirements, which is, by the way, what I built my first part of my career on. And when I realized that I didn't want to manage QA in a traditional org anymore was when I realized that the better I got at my job, the more requirements I was injecting at the end, and the more churn I was causing my organizations, and the more it cost. If I was really good at my job, I could say, what about this, what about that, what about this, and we could go through a whole bunch of scenarios. I would find a whole bunch of bugs. Every single one of those bugs is an assertion about a requirement that should have been in place in the system. And by asserting at the end that this should have been in place, I am now inventing new requirements. And those requirements may or may not actually have been on target for the strategy, the direction that the product organization wanted this thing to go. So putting QA in charge of acceptance basically creates that vector for let's insert a whole bunch of requirements by taking the product manager and saying, dear product manager, you're going to think about strategy, but you're also going to think about tactics, and you're also going to be thinking about how are you going to know that you got what you asked for. Now let's make the acceptance criteria really clear. We're going to talk about it. A story is just a placeholder for a conversation. But in that conversation, we're going to be asking these questions. How do you know that you got what you asked for? And let's capture some of that. So that, to remind you how you're going to accept this story, and then when it's delivered, and by the way, we also do acceptance all throughout. We don't wait until the end with a sprint demo. It's all the time. As soon as a story is delivered, product manager can accept it. And the product managers who are really, really good, I swear, I don't know if they've like synced up their smartwatches to Pivotal Tracker, which is what we use because we're Pivotal, so that they get alerted every time there's a story, but they will like accept a story within minutes of it being delivered, the ones who are really, really effective, which is awesome for flow and for morale. I mean, what better feeling as a developer than you deliver a thing and 10 minutes later the product manager essentially is thanking you for it. That feels pretty good, right? So there are lots of good things to having product managers in charge of acceptance, but this also means that we don't have to have a whole bunch of people who are doing this magical thing called acceptance testing and nobody actually knows what they do. It's the product manager's job. Usually that's manual, by the way, but we also test drive all the things. So teams as a whole own their quality, and as developers, our developers have a whole lot of very rigorous practices that come from extreme programming. We are unapologetically entirely an extreme programming shop with our own little spin on extreme programming, but pairing, test-driven development, continuous integration, all of the extreme programming practices are baked into our DNA as a company. In fact, it's kind of funny to watch people on teams that are odd for the day, because we never would send somebody home like, oh, don't come to work today, we're odd. Like we would never do that. But then they have to solo, and they look uncomfortable sometimes. Like, I'm missing my and then you find this weird social thing happens, that the person who is soloing becomes the person who everybody goes to if they've got a question for the team, and it's almost as though they've lost their protective cover. They're now vulnerable because they're alone. So they will be circled, but anyway. So we pair fully automated regression tests. Part of doing test-driven development means that we automatically get a fully automated set of regression tests. Those run in CI all the time. So that means that we've checked all of the expectations before it even gets to the product manager. We know that it does all the things that we intended it to do as code. And because we've got 22 sub-teams and lots of those things have to come together to work as a cohesive system, we have entire pipelines. This particular GUI is from GoCD. We have now transitioned to using ThoughtWorks GoCD for an awful lot of our builds. It's not the only CI system we use, but if anybody wants to talk about GoCD later, this isn't really a talk about that, but that's what you're seeing is a screenshot of our build system. Okay, so we did all that stuff, and it was awesome, and that will get you a certain level of quality. And for that matter, I learned how to do extreme programming at Pivotal Labs. Chris talked about 2003. I met Ward Cunningham at Auta. I also met this guy, Rob Mee, and he's the guy who founded Pivotal Labs. And after that, I weaseled my way into one of his projects because I wanted to learn how this extreme programming thing worked. And then I was ruined for working anywhere else. So that's where I learned extreme programming. And my experience with working with Pivotal Labs teams was that I was the worst programmer on the team, probably the best Explorer, but we didn't need anything that looked even remotely like traditional QA at all. And we were able to produce stuff that clients were thrilled with. Like, the quality was amazing. But you take something the size and complexity of Cloud Foundry, and now you try to apply that practice, and you can get close. But there's still going to be risks. There's still going to be things that are emergent behaviors because it's a massively distributed system, things that you only experience under certain circumstances. So that still wasn't enough, even doing all those practices. So then what do we do? Well, that's why I'm here, to talk about the exploratory testing piece and how we use exploratory testing. We capture stuff that we know that we want to explore in a charter. We put the charter in a backlog. That charter in the backlog, the PM prioritizes that like any other story. The deliverable for that charter is information. And so the PM has to weigh in their minds, would I rather have the team deliver a feature, or would I rather have information about this potential risk that we have identified? And you might think that a product manager would always be saying, oh, feature, 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 feature. But remember, the team owns the quality. So the product manager has no incentive to do feature, 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 because if their stuff doesn't work, there's no other place for that message to come back to than the team. So they'll end up doing a whole lot of rework later with pissed off customers. If we're going to do a whole lot of rework, we'd rather do the rework without pissed off customers. So they actually do have an incentive to prioritize the bugs. We also put bugs in the same backlog. So they have an incentive to prioritize their bugs and their charters all in the same backlog, and to actually put charters and bugs near the top frequently. In fact, usually bugs go straight to the top for the most part. So we capture these things as charters, and we'll talk more about charters. Anybody can add charters to the icebox. So let's say that you and your pair are working away and you realize, oh snacks. If this thing does this other, if the flubits does the whatsits to the nurbits, then really, really bad things are probably going to happen, but we're not sure. But this is not on mission for the story that you're implementing. Then you'd go into the into the tracker for the project, and you'd write a charter that then the product manager is going to be able to prioritize. PMs prioritize, and they accept those charters just as they would any other story, but the deliverable is a piece of information, so they have to believe that the questions have been answered. So that the criteria, rather than being a feature that you can actually see, is usually questions that we wanted that exploratory charter sessions to answer. And any pair is going to be able to pick up any charter. Yeah, question? Sorry? Wait, why are you ducking now just because somebody's trying to hand you a microphone?
Do you have any examples of questions that are charters?
I do have examples of charters. They're coming up. So let me just do the last bullet point on dedicated explorers, sometimes augment the team, and on we go. A charter follows the form of explore with to discover. It's like the story form of as a blank I want blank because, which is to say it's a template that's useful but not necessary in all cases. And let's take a look at an example of that. One might be to explore possibilities. So in this case, explore deploying jobs in parallel with CF release to discover an ideal order of jobs to enable the least amount of serial jobs as possible. The whole point of this particular chart, I pulled all of these out of our backlogs, by the way, in case you're wondering why is there so much jargon in here. It's because I wanted real examples. This particular example is because our deploy times are really, really long. And it turns out that if you deploy the jobs in a particular order, then you can get massive parallelization along for some of them. And that's going to shorten the deploy time. And so the idea here is let's just explore the order of the jobs for the deployment to see if we can reach an optimal. So let's explore some possibilities. Other kinds of explore for possibilities things might be almost using an exploratory charter like you would a spike, because basically a charter can be essentially like a spike. Another example, explore intermittent issues. How many of you have ever had an intermittent bug? Drove you nuts, right? Like, you know it happens because there have been multiple witnesses. They're credible witnesses. In fact, maybe you were one of the witnesses. This thing exists, but for the life of you, you cannot pin down the variables that affect its behavior. So if you could identify every single variable that affects its behavior, and you could control every single variable, then there would be no such thing as an intermittent bug. You would just identify, control, and then bam, reproduce the thing, right? but you haven't identified all the variables yet. So this is where charters are really come in handy. You can brainstorm a list of variables that could affect the behavior of the thing, and then you could start tweaking how you interact with the software, or tweaking the load, or whatever it is that you're tweaking in order to reproduce the issue. So in this case, this one is explore large pools of executors running at the same time to discover bad behavior related to race conditions or flaws in claiming runs, being reasonable values of large. And so this was they added some specificity so that we didn't have just the word large sitting there. This particular charter came out of one of our components in the guts of Cloud Foundry. It's actually the next generation of the component. It's called Diego, and its mission in life is to execute your application. And so you've deployed your application to Cloud Foundry, and Diego has a whole bunch of VMs. Each VM has a whole bunch of containers. Your instances of your application are running in containers, and because it's doing things like saying, okay, now I need to run a new instance of this application, and different nodes within that cluster of executors are vying for the right to run that instance. They're bidding against each other. There's the possibility of race conditions. And so here we've got a charter that's all about exploring to discover the conditions under which bad race conditions could happen. Make sense? Yes?
Sure. What's the average number of developers per PM in this case?
So our team, our ideal is 1 PM, a set of developers, 2 to 3 pairs is where our sweet spot is. They have one backlog and 1 set of repos. That's our ideal. Sometimes we vary that depending on the circumstances. Sometimes we'll have a PM that works with 2 different teams, but our team size is 2 to 3 pairs typically.
Here's another question from one of our remote viewers. Can you articulate how a charter is different from a technical spike?
Sure. A technical spike is an instance of a charter, but charters aren't always technical spikes.
Okay, and one more. Are charters time boxed at all? How do you budget for charters in a team velocity?
Okay. So as a matter of practice, by the way, at this point I'm going to give up on the slides because there weren't that many more that were interesting, and all of your questions would be answered later, so then I'd go through the slides and I'd be like, oh, we talked about this. Oh, we talked about this. That's boring. So let's just do a conversation. That's way more interesting. There's an example. Yay. Oh, and I sent the slides beforehand, so presumably you'll have access to them if you actually cared about every single written word in there. Not nearly as interesting as talking about this stuff. So how do we budget for charters, and do we time box? There are, for the way that we practice this, we typically do not time box, but sometimes a PM will say, it is only worth 4 hours of a pair's time to me to get the answer to this question. So do whatever you can do in 4 hours. Give me whatever information results. Don't go over budget on this one because it's just not worth it to me. But if the answer is really, really important and the time isn't going to be the thing that we're going to cut short. There is an entire school of thought around session-based exploratory testing. It's a thing, like you can Google session-based exploratory testing and you'll come up with really interesting articles. I highly recommend reading those articles because there are other ways of organizing your exploration, and we just happen to not follow that particular model. When it comes to how do you account for this in your velocity, we've decided as a matter of convention that charters are 0-point stories. So the way that we do velocity, bugs count as 0, chores are technical tasks that the engineering side of the team decides that they need to do. Those count as 0. The only thing that gets points are essentially the value stories that the product manager asked for, and that might seem unfair, but what we're really trying to calculate is if we look at on aggregate, on average, how much value can that team deliver, and everything else is just, it's going to drive the number lower, but lower isn't worse. Like you would never, ever, ever go, well, your team did 52 points this week, and your team did 32, so obviously there's something wrong with you. Like that you don't do that ever. It's just a mechanism that allows you to have some level of predictability, and so by making everything that's not value have 0 points, we get that level of predictability.
So everywhere I've been, there's always like an infinite amount of bugs, and some of them, like not like constantly bugs, like new bugs all the time, but there's some bugs that are like, you know, we don't need to fix this right now, but we should fix it. So how do you and then you said bugs are at the top priority. So how do you? That means that there's no bugs in the list before you start features. So how do you manage that?
Well, so we don't hold, I would love to say that we hold strictly to the bugs always go at the top and you don't do anything new until you fixed all the bugs, but the reality is sometimes there are bugs that for whatever reason it's just not as important as this feature that we're going to be delivering next, and there are very good strategic reasons for that. But one of the advantages of having the bugs in the same system as everything else is that you can start to see that we have bug. You start scrolling through the things and there's like 5,000 bugs. That's an opportunity to take a step back and go, oh, something's going terribly, terribly wrong. Why would we have this many bugs? So I'm sure there was another aspect to your question that I am completely forgetting right now. I got a little bit stuck on infinite bugs and was having PTSD on my previous experience as a quality engineering manager at the end of a cycle and doing bug scrub meetings. And see, I'm twitching. So could you ask your question again and I'll stop twitching?
Yes. So there's just some bugs that you never really get to. There's always at least some bugs on the list.
Oh, then delete it. Like, seriously.
Or
if
at
you're
least,
never going to fix it, delete it out of the backlog.
maybe not never, but like not today or not this week, but next week. So
you're going to do it in 6 months?
I guess, yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
Then delete it. Like, if it's really important, it'll keep coming back. You presumably have a separate support system of some kind so that you can get feedback from the actual users of your system. And if they tell you it's important, then you're going to end up prioritizing it higher. But if, as a PM, you're looking at this and going, I think that the possibility of somebody hitting this is incredibly low. I think that the impact if they hit this is incredibly low. I cannot justify prioritizing this high enough that we are likely to get to this anytime in the next 6 months. At this point, it's now just a distraction. It's clutter. So get it out of your backlog so you don't have the clutter.
I have a question.
Yes.
Since we left your slides behind. So Cloud Foundry is a very complex project, as you say. When you do exploratory testing, where do you do it? Do you find it valuable to model Cloud Foundry somehow? And if so, what size is that model? And how closely does it map to the actual Cloud Foundry? And yeah, that sort of thing. I'm very interested in modeling such complex systems because we face the same challenge here, modeling Wikipedia. You know, or do you just simply test in production? I mean, what's the answer to the size of the environment in which you do exploratory testing?
Well, yes to all of the above. We are in a slightly different circumstance than the Wikimedia Foundation because I don't think that I could put my own Wikimedia up on my own hardware. Could I? Do you ship that? Yes. Okay. Well, do you care about testing all of the various configurations in which somebody might do that? No. Right. I have to care about that. So let's take Elastic Runtime is the core of our system. It's the thing that knows how to take requests to deploy an app and then deploy the app across multiple instances, across multiple executors. And that's like the core of the app. We do not at the moment model all of the possible permutations in which somebody might stand up one of those, but as a matter of practice between the various teams that would either be responsible for producing the Elastic Runtime Core, or we have a release engineering team that's responsible for packaging that for our commercial distribution, and we have got a team that produces the GUI-based installer that knows how to deploy a Cloud Foundry. Between those three teams, we end up testing in multiple different configurations, and then when we are exploring, we're going to be exploring in the context of each of those teams. So we don't do like a big modeling session, let's spend 2 weeks trying to model all the things, and then we dig in to explore. Instead, it's a lot more tactical. It's a much more of a point kind of thing where we say, all right, look, here's a set of risks we're worried about. Let's express those as charters. You're going to be within this particular team that owns the backlog that those charters went into. You're going to be doing whatever you need to do to get the answers to those questions. Like the one about deploying was one from the Elastic Runtime team. What's the right order in which to deploy? So maybe take what you imagined we might do and then shrink it down to an actually accomplishable size of chunk of thing that you could do in a few days. Does that answer your question? Okay. Chris says yes. Yes.
So, I would like to know about role of logs in your system. Which tools do you use? Do you use like Splunk or any other open source tools for this?
So the role of logs in our system, and the example of the tool you gave was, I'm sorry, I didn't catch
pretty
it.
much I'm trying to understand how much you as QA use logs, what tools do you use pretty much to monitor environments and troubleshoot find issues.
Okay, so logs certainly enable us to pinpoint issues, and we use them frequently, especially when we start seeing problems in our staging. We've got a, so to back up a little bit, we have our hosted version on AWS. It's at run.pivotal.io. We have staging environments that are slightly scaled down, but essentially the same exact configuration of that. So a fair amount of testing is happening in those staging environments, even for the open source. So even though the open source is it's a separate thing, having those staging environments available for testing the open source, super handy. So we've got two kinds of logs in our system. We have system logs, and we've got an internal mechanism within the system, which was the syslog aggregator, and I need to go learn more about exactly what we've done with the new generation of things, but essentially a syslog aggregator. So you've got a gazillion VMs all within your cluster, and getting the logs off of those VMs at the operating system level, that's the syslog aggregator. And then we've got the application log aggregator. So you're an application developer. You should never, ever, ever have access to the system logs, obviously, because that's the VM that's running the system. But you should have access to standard out for your own application. That needs to be aggregated across multiple instances. So two types of logging, application and system, and the mechanism by which we get those is built into Cloud Foundry. It's part of the feature of the product. And we were using, oh, I'm just going to get it wrong, but some combination of Kibana, Elasticsearch, and some other stuff to enable us to make it much easier to search within those logs to find the log entries that were right around a particular anomaly that we detected. No Splunk? Yeah, we're not using Splunk internally. I mean, application developers who use our platform certainly can hook up Splunk, but we're not using it ourselves. Yeah, if you are standing up your own Cloud Foundry, you could stand up a similar kind of thing. We do use Datadog for monitoring, which turns out to be really important for when you see a thing spike that shouldn't spike, and then you can go search in the logs to figure out what was going on and why did that thing spike.
Yeah, sorry if you've covered this, but I just want to clarify like what you see exploratory testing as providing, or how you would differentiate it from other forms of testing. You know, because I don't know, I'm sure you have, you know, your unit and your integration and everything, but
I totally forgot to say, I wrote this book. And I'm leaving a copy of it with the Wikimedia Foundation here. Chris will know where to find it, so if you're here, you can browse through this, and there's a bunch of stuff. But the short answer to your question is that exploratory testing is a practice of simultaneously learning about the behavior of the system while designing test cases and executing them so that you can immediately observe those results and use that to steer you to the next little experiment that you're going to do. So it's like a series of experiments. And by contrast, a very traditional view, and when I say traditional, I'm realizing, I've been at the DevOps Enterprise Conference this week. It's down by the airport, and every single talk has been about DevOps, and somehow it's had the words test and quality in sufficient number that people have been saying we should create a drinking game around this, so it's been kind of entertaining. But what's been even more entertaining is realizing that I often throw up this straw man of traditional QA, and I'm going to have to stop doing that because nobody does that anymore. But in the old straw man of traditional QA, you would have like these manual test procedures, and if you printed it out, it would be a stack of paper this big, and it's a very script-oriented thing that you, dear tester, you're going to do this, and then this, and then this. Click this button, enter this value into this field, watch the form load. I hate my life. Click this button, enter this value into this field. That level of manual regression testing is the antithesis of exploration because you have to stick to the script. Does that contrast help? Cool.
Okay. So my question is, I'm not sure about the architecture of Cloud Foundry, but I've experienced situations where teams that are downstream from other teams, when they explore, they find some of their issue, but a lot of issues from these other teams, and then they have some issues with their velocity, and there's some kind of feelings of the other teams not keeping up their end of the bargain. So I'm curious if you've experienced that.
Oh, totally, and it didn't even take exploratory testing. CI is awesome for finding those kinds of things. So we have I have to back up and explain that we have this thing called CF release. You saw it referred to in one of the charters. That's a BOSH release. BOSH is our deployment and orchestration tool, and it's got a particular notion of how you should structure a directory, how you should create your directory structure so it knows how to deploy all the things. What we want to deploy when we deploy all the things is the result of multiple teams, not just a single team. Now, this is not exactly in the ideal for how we like to run things, but it kind of is what it is. And we've talked about, should we have multiple BOSH releases so that each team can have their own BOSH release? But no matter what future plans hold, we are where we are. And we have had the case where CF release has a bunch of submodule pointers. We use Git. And so in CI, the CI system goes off and deploys the thing, starts running the system acceptance tests, and things start failing all over the place, and come to find out that it was a check-in where somebody bumped the submodule pointer to something for a component that was controlled by some other team that does not feel direct responsibility for the tests that are running right now. And so this doesn't even take exploration. This just happens as part of CI. And there was a fair amount of foment and consternation because pointing to fingers, you broke the build. And it took us a while to get really good at having a collaborative enough. It didn't help that they were in different time zones. So one team that's contributing is in Boulder. The other team is in San Francisco. And so it's really easy to not see these people who are in Boulder in quite the same way that you see your neighbor who is sitting right next to you. They're other because they're somewhere else and you don't see them every day. And so we had to get really good at getting people on a hangout. Hey, something's up with the build. Let's investigate it together. Do some paired remote pairing to figure out what's going on. Hey, let's retro on this. How could we prevent this from happening in the future? What kinds of test environments do you need to stand up? So that's all totally normal. The only thing that worried me in your question was when you talked about, oh, takes a hit to velocity. Okay. That's why velocity is so awesome, because I'm not trying to hit a goal. It's not a target. Like, I'm going to make 18 velocity this week. So help me, 18. No, that creates all kinds of dysfunction, because then you won't want to pull over the chores that are things that really need to be done, that are about making the images on your machines completely repeatable so you don't have any snowflakes. You aren't going to want to fix the bugs. If the PM prioritizes bugs up high, you're going to be like, no, because then we won't get the points for them. So I'm not worried about velocity. I don't want to worry about velocity. Velocity is an after effect, not a target. It's a thing that I look at and measure so that I get predictability. Everything else is just people learning how to work together and not be jerks to each other.
I was going to say, in this particular place, it was part of their performance reviews, so oops.
Okay, that would be the other dysfunction there. If velocity ever shows up in your performance reviews, something is horribly, horribly wrong. Did I mention we're hiring? Okay. Both. So the open source stuff, totally open to the public. Oh, so the question was, is your bug reporting system open to the public or is it closed? And my answer is both, because for the open source stuff, you can totally see all of our trackers. If you go to, I think it's wiki.cloudfoundry.org, but anyway, if you go to cloudfoundry.org and then click to get to the wiki, then on the right-hand side of the wiki, you will see links to all of our trackers, and our trackers are where we store bugs, chores, charters, and stories. So you can totally see all of the kinds of bugs that we get, and if you really are curious about whether or not I'm lying about that whole prioritize the bugs thing, you could just follow your favorite bugs through the system and see how long it takes them to get prioritized. By the way, if they bug you, like if it's something that you care about, you can also use the message forum to lobby hobby for your bugs or GitHub, we tend to be pretty responsive to that. So those are all open. Our closed source stuff, well, it's commercial. Sorry.
Maybe try this one, sorry.
The reason to ask is because at the Wikimedia Foundation, basically all is open except some private things, security, etc. And I was connecting this with the fact that you said that after 6 months just delete it. Because, I mean, I had the thought sometimes of just running a query and I'm doing actually that with anything that is older than 2 years. I wouldn't say even 6 months. But that would create some, I don't know, some people would be upset out there. So, yeah, so I wonder if you really close bugs that...
The comment was they're already upset because their bug didn't get fixed in 2 years.
Projects do that all the time. I mean, not to take over the discussion, but like GNU does that, you know, Mozilla does that. I think you could do that. It's not my talk, but...
So for us, we do that. However, when you file a bug against the open source, you don't have the ability to file it directly in the tracker. So the way that we manage that is you file it on GitHub, and then we've got a little service that goes and listens up for GitHub pull requests and bugs and shoves those into the tracker. So the tracker represents what the team's actually going to do, but there's still this record out there. We didn't actually expunge some data that somebody bothered to collect. However, we will close the GitHub issue as essentially we're not going to fix this, which is much more in line with what other open source projects would do.
So that status is actually going to be called won't fix, or does it have some kind of other name?
It depends. I'm sure we've answered these in a variety of ways. Won't fix is one of them. Thank you very, very much for taking the time to report this thing. We really appreciate that you care this deeply. However, at this time, we're not open to considering this. That's another variation on it.
As a boilerplate, or, I mean, so how much time do you invest in thank you, but no?
It varies. So this seems to be on topic, and it's not actually on topic for exploratory testing, but I'm going to tell you what we did anyway, because you guys are in a similar situation. We have so experimented with how to manage the relationship with the community, and relatively early on, at least in my involvement with Cloud Foundry, it was tremendously difficult for our teams to pay attention to what was going on in GitHub, because they're supposed to be working out of the tracker, and so they can't split their time between I'm going to look at the tracker and now I'm going to go pay attention to what's going on in the community. Thus the whole bot and service thing was born. But even then, they felt that it was tremendously distracting as individual engineers to be having to pay attention to the community. This was a long time ago, but so we experimented, and what we came up with was there's a community pair. And so every week there would be, your stint on community pair was 2 weeks long, and every week somebody new would rotate on. So let's say you start, somebody's been there for a week already, they know the context, and they're the ones, the community pair was then the ones who were responding and taking the time to craft nice messages, and their mission in life was make the community's experience awesome. Whatever you have to do for that, just make that experience awesome. If that means merging pull requests, well, it's not going to be an awesome experience if you merge something that you're not sure works, so you better make sure that you merge it safely, but it might be merging pull requests, it might be responding to the mail list, it might be whatever. So we tried that, and that worked really well for a long time, and because there was a new pair rotating on every single week, you might imagine that 3 weeks later, there's a completely different set of people answering. The quality of the answers is going to be very different because it's different people and they just interact with the community differently. And so highly variable, depending on who was on the community pair. Over time, it became excruciatingly difficult to get people onto the community pair because they're like, why do I want to rotate off of my team for 2 weeks? I want to stay on my team and do my thing. And the PMs all kind of stood up and said, you know, kind of feels like we should be managing the relationship with the community. And so now we have a model where teams own their relationship with the community, and the PM is often the one who is responding to, especially if it's a delicate response of, we value your input very highly, dear community collaborator, however in this case. And then now it's variable, but it's not variable for a given set of repos. It's variable depending on which product manager and their style. And we have some product managers who frankly are a little harsher than I'm comfortable with, denied, or whatever. And then we have product managers who are very gracious and gentle, but it's still variable, just in a different way. Was that, by the way, this is a good time for me to get feedback from you. Was that an interesting story? Should I continue to tell stories like that, or should I stick to the topic? Interesting story, got lots of thumbs up, and nobody walked out. So I'm just going to keep talking. Great. What's next?
So for your open source version, like how do you manage open source and commercial version? You mentioned about GitHub, which is pretty much open to everybody, and then you have another repository for closed source. Also with GitHub, like how do you manage it?
Yeah, so, oh sure, so the question was, how do we manage the fact that we've got this open source stuff and this commercial stuff? We use GitHub, different repositories or what? And the answer is yes, totally. Not only different repositories, but entirely different organizations. So if you go to GitHub and you go to the Cloud Foundry organization, or you go to the Cloud Foundry Incubator organization, all of that stuff, I mean, first of all, if you can see it and you're not part of Cloud Foundry, then obviously it's open, but that's all part of the Cloud Foundry open source. We are in the process of standing up a foundation that, kind of like the Apache Foundation owns the Apache stuff, we are in the process of standing up a foundation that's going to own all of that, so there will be a clear separation between open source and commercial. We have a separate org for all of the commercial stuff, in fact, a couple of separate orgs for the commercial stuff, and for the most part, although not entirely, but for the most part, the teams are also completely separate. There are only a few teams where they're doing a mixture of commercial and open source, and the closer we get to that foundation being stood up, the more we're going to be separating that so that we've got a very clear separation between all the things that are open and then all of the commercial interests, because we don't want to have even the perception that our commercial interests in Cloud Foundry as pivotal are polluting the open source. Does that make sense?
Okay, so and because you have like open source version, apparently like anybody can get it and install it whenever we want. But so if do you provide any kind of hosting in your environment for any free tier with hosting, like maybe some
Yeah, so anybody who wants to get the open source code totally can, and then the question is, but do you provide any kind of free hosting? No, we really don't. So we've got run.pivotal.io is part of our commercial interests. It's a hosted environment. You can deploy your apps there. We've got a 30-day free trial, and then our prices are ridiculously cheap, and we've talked about having a free tier, but ultimately it's up to product. It's not up to me. I'm on the geek side, but the business people decided that they didn't want to support a free tier.
So I have another question.
Yes.
If you could, and I bring this up because we've had this discussion internally and we have not come to any conclusions, but if you could compare and contrast perhaps exploratory testing versus checklists. I know that there's a lot of research even in the medical field about the efficiency and effectiveness of checklists. Is there a relationship between checklists and exploratory testing, or are they valuable in different ways or in the same way?
Okay, so I love me a good checklist. Now, I do use kind of a form of checklist in exploratory testing. Usually it's the stuff that's in my head that I rattle off to myself, like, ooh, I found a text field. I know what to do with text fields. I'm going to insert really long text. I'm going to insert Unicode. I'm going to insert emojis. I'm going to, all of the evil things that you do to text fields. That's kind of like a checklist. And for that matter, I call these things heuristics, and there's a whole list of them in the book that I'm leaving behind. But what I don't do is, okay, now I'm going to explore Cloud Controller. Cloud Controller's responsibilities are to take API requests to deploy an application, and so basically Cloud Controller allows you to create, read, update, and delete applications. So it's CRUDing apps for you. So now I should have a checklist item for create an app, I should have a checklist item for read the files in an application. I should have a checklist item for updating an application. If I know what I want to do to that level of precision and repeatability, that should be an automated test. So did that? Okay, you're welcome.
I have a question. I have a question. So do you recruit explorers in the community? So do you,
I see. Sorry, keep going. I thought I knew where you were going, and then I didn't. So.
Okay.
Yes.
No. So for instance, I don't know. Do you find out if there's certain people that keep reporting interesting bugs, for instance, and then you try to get them somehow involved so they understand better where you're going to, etc. So basically recruiting explorers out there in the community, get them involved in your day-to-day.
So not yet. And one of the things that's interesting about Cloud Foundry is that it's really rare for somebody to wake up one day and say, I know, I've got a spare Saturday. I feel like I want to stand up my very own Cloud Foundry. Like the individual person typically doesn't do that. Instead, they arrive at a company that says, hey, we've made a big bet on this thing. Go for it. You're going to be working on this pull request to do whatever. So it's usually not individuals, it's companies. And as we get closer and closer to the foundation being stood up, we certainly may start to see a lot more engagement from some of the members of that foundation. What we're seeing right now is a lot of collaboration, which is super, super awesome. But I don't think we've seen specifically collaboration or contributions that are specifically about exploring yet, but I think it'll be really interesting when we do.
There's an academic paper published just 2-3 days ago, a study done from Mozilla, and they found that agile projects have a very hard time keeping volunteers because they move so quickly. It's very difficult to parachute in and contribute to a project that's moving so quickly unless you're devoting hours every day tracking the project. This was based on Mozilla, and Kim and I know we've had the same experience here, is that I've run test events and things like this with casual contributors, even expert exploratory testing testers looking for hours, and the results are issues that are all either duplicate, won't fix, or else they're already in the backlog. So they don't produce very much useful information. I'll point you to this study because everybody did a study. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I would find that very interesting.
Apologies for the somewhat abstract question, but I'm hello.
Blinded.
So I'm kind of wondering, this is a problem you see in research as well. A lot of the technology that we have nowadays is possible because of research that was done like 30 years ago. But how do you actually, how do you follow the trail from your exploratory testing? I imagine some of this stuff, you mentioned, for instance, the effort is like 0. But I'm wondering, how do you prevent the situation where you get like the boy who cried wolf, let's say. Someone does exploratory testing, they don't find the bug, and then eventually we become desensitized and we say, we shouldn't do this exploratory testing thing anymore. Or some bug was prevented in the future, but then you can't really account for that because the bug never happened. How do you encourage that within an organization? How do you reward it?
So far we don't have that problem. I've actually been thrilled because you said apologies for the abstract question. I'm going to give you an abstract answer, but then I'll actually come back to your question, I swear. But I'm going to tell a story. So we set out to recruit explorers, and we managed to hire 2. And one of them was such a high-caliber developer that it didn't make sense to be rotating him in and out of teams as rapidly as we had intended to rotate explorers. And so he just became a dev, and he happens to be really good at exploring. And then we've got another explorer who's a dedicated explorer. And we set out to recruit more. I mean, we've been trying really hard. I do a lot of interviews, and we're not finding more. And so, of course, I had to think, well, so how bad a problem is that? Like, do I need to start shaking the trees more to find more explorers, or what's going on? And so I started paying a lot of attention. And what I found was that wherever an explorer had touched a team, like had rotated on for any period of time, the practice stuck. It just stuck because there are always questions that we always need answers to. So without an explorer on the team, they were still writing charters, and the product manager was still prioritizing those charters, and they were still exploring. They didn't need a dedicated explorer. So the practice stuck really well. High stickiness factor. We'll still totally hire any good explorers we find, but I've totally stopped panicking about the fact that we can't find more explorers. And the high value that the organization is getting out of it still means that I'm not worried that somebody's going to say we should stop this exploring stuff. We also made it super easy. Like, exploring is just, you put a charter in the backlog as a placeholder for this thing that you're going to do. It's not a, okay, now I need a 6-month dedicated effort. It's a story, and you can prioritize the story. So it's in such small chunks. I think that the odds that somebody would say, this exploring stuff, it has no value, we shouldn't do any more of it, I think the odds are really low because the cost for each one of those is really, really low. So did I manage to answer your question? Yes, good, okay. Anything else, guys?
So related to what you just said, how long is the period that the explorer was rotated onto a team to get that stickiness?
Well, you know, the shortest rotation we had was probably a week, and it's still stuck. So I think that it just, one of the things that I love about working at Pivotal with people who are accustomed to the Pivotal Labs practices is that they're already really good explorers. They just don't know it. They don't have words to describe this thing that they do naturally. And so I think that for those developers, because that's how we built the team, is we just continued to grow those practices in a team that was very adamant about those practices. I think that when they see exploration done in a structured kind of way, like here's a charter, and now we're going to investigate this charter, and oh, this is a distraction from the charter, so we're going to capture that as another charter, it feels so natural to them. They're like, oh, I finally have words to describe a thing that I just do. And so that means that we don't have to like train them in this. Although I used to get on airplanes and go help people, and one of the ways that I would help them is to train exploratory testers. And so I've run my workshops for some of the teams, and they found that helpful because they could say, oh, I always felt like there was kind of a technique here, but I was really fuzzy on it, and so now I've got a very concrete set of ideas around what that technique was, but that's not what made it stick. All right, so it looks like there's no more questions, and it's looking to me like it's about 7:30. So how about if instead of going through all the slides, I just go to the very end and mention that you might wonder what I do, since I'm the director of quality engineering and I don't direct quality engineers, and teams are responsible for their quality, and we do have a few explorers. My job is to see to the care and feeding of the feedback cycles. And by the way, every single thing that we've been talking about here is an example of that. So all of the different kinds of testing and how do you know and how do you interact with the community, all of those things, they're all examples of feedback cycles. So that's my job. All right, guys, thank you so much. It was a great pleasure to be here.